Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about plant medicine, get rid of the myths, and change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today are two guests, Yonason Goldson and Sandra Dreisbach. Sandra is an ethicist with a Ph.D. in philosophy, exploring ethical decision-making and moral philosophy. Sandra has taught bioethics at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and worked for many years in the tech industry, primarily at Apple. Just a little bit impressive. On the topic of impressive, let's talk about Yonason. Yonason works with leaders to create a culture of ethics that builds trust, sparks initiative, and drives productivity. He's a keynote speaker, trainer, coach, and TEDx presenter, as well as a rabbi and a podcast host. Yonason and Sandra, welcome to the show.
Pleasure, Scott. You, Scott, and Webdelics for having us.
It is a pleasure to have you here. Now, the purpose of today's episode is to discuss ethical issues that everyday people might be facing as they are considering whether engaging in a psychedelic experience is right for them, or if they are confronted with someone in their life who is considering using one and they're feeling qualms inside. We're going to be talking about three specific situations in which psychedelic experiences may come up as part of one's life journey that raise a variety of different, and I would argue, potentially escalating ethical conflicts. The first, the situation in which someone, maybe you, maybe someone that you care about very dearly, is coming into the psychedelics and plant medicine world to deal with mental health issues. The second is a situation in which someone is seeking to use psychedelics to enhance their creativity or their work or other performance. The final situation is one in which an individual is seeking spiritual connection. And psychedelics, they've heard, might be an area in which that can happen that might not have otherwise worked for them. As people who are watching this series know, I am not a seasoned psychedelic journeyer. I'm someone who, at this point in my life, after having listened to the stories of individuals that have had psychedelic experiences, as well as had discussions with scientists and thought leaders in the space, this may be something that I want to explore for a variety of reasons myself. And as I mentioned in the very first episode of this podcast, those reasons relate principally to a history of severe trauma that I had going back to my childhood. And I've come a long way in dealing with them, but I still wrestle with the ghosts of those childhood experiences to this very day. And they cause pain. And so I really empathize with the everyday person who isn't steeped in the psychedelic world, who might want to make sure that when they go into this, that it's not only a matter of medical safety and scientific security, and not only a matter of things that other people have found helpful, but something that is ethically right. And so with that in mind, I'm going to go deeper into each of those subject matter areas and ask you all some questions. And we're hopefully going to at least get some groundwork laid down that people who are considering these sorts of experiences for themselves can consider and do what's right. Because if there's anything that I've learned about humanity through this podcast, through podcasting generally, is that the overwhelming majority of people in this world have a desperate desire to do the right thing. So, of the three scenarios, let's start out with the one that, at least to my eyes, seems the most ethically easy to come to a conclusion about, but maybe I'm wrong. As we all know, in most jurisdictions, particularly in the United States, psychedelics are illegal. And let's use the U.S. as an example. Even in jurisdictions where it has been decriminalized, the regulatory infrastructure is a little bit sketchy. Also, some religious organizations have very strong prohibitions, or if not very strong, outright prohibitions, some implicit moral concerns about utilizing tools that alter the mind. At the same time, if you are in one of those jurisdictions where the legality is murky or are part of a religious organization that frowns upon mind-altering substances as a tool that you might use in your life, crises such as PTSD or addiction, suicidal ideation, and more might seem like they are such an emergency. I mean, literally, someone's life could be on the line because of these sorts of mental health issues, that psychedelic use may seem like the only option that an individual has to recover their life. Under those scenarios, Yonason, how would you counsel someone who came to you for ethical guidance?
Well, I think you teed it up very nicely, Scott, that the ethical questions in the case of trauma are minimal. There's the general ethical approach that all medicine needs to be safe. It needs to be determined to be safe. It has to be administered under the care of somebody who understands what's appropriate dosage and such. But in a case of trauma, it's very easy, certainly from a religious point of view, and I think from an ethical point of view, to allow and encourage. For instance, a couple of years ago, my wife fell down and shattered her elbow. And where we live, it wasn't easy to get access to some medical marijuana in some form that I think would have been extremely helpful for her. Instead, she was given the opioids that she reacted to terribly. It's just a tremendous amount of pain. When I think that there were very simple remedies available that could have made things much more comfortable for her. If you go to more deep-rooted trauma, childhood trauma, emotional trauma, PTSD, if these are safe and safely administered, then there's really no objection whatsoever, as there would be any other form of medicine. I think that one of the complications arises is when the law prohibits something that is clearly beneficial, and the law really needs to be reexamined. But in the meantime, we are citizens of a society where we want to follow the laws. That does create a kind of ethical tension. And without being so bold as to say, go out and break the law, I think that there are circumstances where the health of the individual may be the overriding concern.
Now, before we go any further with what you just said, Yonason, I want to just make something very clear. It was a little bit embedded in what I said during your introduction, but I want to just throw this out here. My understanding of your orientation as an ethicist and as a rabbi is that you are not some wild-eyed, let's tear down the system and create a revolution sort of individual. My impression of you is that you are careful and considered, but when it comes to the religious orientation that informs your ethical grounding, in my opinion, and argue with me, you are conservative.
Well, conservative with a small c.
Yeah, and explain what that means to the audience. And that's an important point to make, because that's what I meant, but not everyone may understand that.
My TED Talk, I talk about the danger of labels, but sometimes they are necessary. And I am what would be called an Orthodox rabbi. The media would call me an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, although ultra-Orthodox is in fact a media term, but not an authentic term. And all of my decisions are based in the Jewish tradition that goes all the way back to Sinai. That being said, I recognize that I live in a world where not everybody acknowledges that system. I don't advocate necessarily that the secular laws of the United States should be designed around Torah law. But it is something that informs the way I look at the world, and I'll integrate that more as we get into later parts of this discussion.
Thank you. I appreciate you clarifying that. And one other question that I have for you, thinking about what you just said a moment ago, in a way, you are perhaps to a difference in degree, arguing that the ethical situation faced by someone wanting to deal with a deep-rooted trauma, but the solution to the trauma is illegal is a little bit akin to those faced by civil rights heroes like Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, who were faced with a problem. In Rosa Parks' famous case, being forced to sit at the back of the bus purely because of her race. She could have just followed the law, or she could have broken that law, and she did so with a clear conscience. I think it's almost universally recognized. Is that a fair equivocation there?
I think so. It's very hard to generalize. You go back to the Declaration of Independence. The men who signed it were all committing treason.
What are we as Americans going to say about that? Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and they all would have been executed had the British had the opportunity to do that. So there is a principle that's embedded in the very origins of United States legal philosophy that when the law is unjust, that responsible citizens have an obligation to speak out against it, perhaps to act against it. Now, when do you cross the line into revolution? I'm not sure that's really the topic of our discussion, but it does again create this kind of ethical tension that I want to honor the laws of my country, but I also want to take a stand for laws that I see as being unethical. And, that's not an easy path to navigate.
Yeah. Sandra, I see you smiling over there. I know you've got something to say. So I'm turning the mic over to you. Say it.
Say your name, Scott.
Quoting Destiny's Child. I love it.
No, and I really appreciate all the thoughts that were already just shared. And I agree. It really is. I mean, at least speaking ethically, right, to make that decision of when is it appropriate to stand up for what you believe is morally correct for you, correct for your community, correct for your society, correct for your country, right, or for your spiritual religion or tradition. That's something we all navigate every day. And there's sometimes these pivotal moments where we have to make, really extra conscious choices and decide whether are we compromising our integrity or is it something that we need to take a stand for? And each person needs to, and each community and each holder of their own journey has to navigate for themselves. And I think we can both agree that we need to empower people to be able to make their own decisions. And I also want to recognize, Scott, that your open vulnerability here at the beginning here, sharing your own experience with trauma and PTSD and seeking solutions for your own mental health. I just want to hold deep, compassionate space for you and for anyone else who has experiencing this. I think mental health concerns are very pervasive in our country, and especially now after COVID or during the sort of last vestiges of us experiencing the lockdown portions of COVID. Never has it been more important to look towards that wellness, that emotional wellness, that mental wellness, and simple care and support for one another that I hope that we've gained from the experience of COVID, even deeper compassion and support for one another. I will also recognize that, yes, I agree that for the most part in the United States, most psychedelics are illegal, at least in terms of the ones that we traditionally think about. When we think about, for instance, LSD, MDMA, right? But there are some psychedelics that are legal. Ketamine, for example, some debate whether or not that's considered to be a psychedelic or not, but that is legally available through a psychiatric or psychologist or, prescribing physician with support. And there's more and more of these ketamine clinics appearing throughout the United States, at least in terms of speaking of from a United States perspective. And you mentioned suicidal ideation, and I know many have found it supportive for when they're dealing with a crisis situation for suicidal ideation. Let alone it doesn't have some of the research behind it in the sense of emotional and mental wellness, but it has a long-standing history in terms of medical use, in terms of safety, and so that's part of the reason. There are some issues around addiction, and I'm not a medical provider, and I can't really speak to that, but I think that there are unique issues with each medicine. But speaking back to what is available legally, There are some, legally available, accessible trials. So MDMA, for instance, through MAPS clinical trials in the United States, they're now in phase 3 wrapping up. And a lot of it has shown supportive for actually helping people with not just PTSD, but complex PTSD, CPTSD, those that have recalcitrant PTSD, like in veterans, etc. So there is hope. And I think at the very least, if we can give people that there's hope and that there's promise that more of these therapies will be available. In Oregon now, they're working on making it legal. Technically, the law has made it legal, but it's not currently accessible yet. They're still working on that in practice. So that also is happening as well as in Colorado, and of course, many decrim. So hopefully that kind of wraps up at least a lot of the topics you guys all touched on. And I will turn it back to you, Scott.
Thank you so much. I personally appreciate the fact that you are willing to acknowledge the vulnerability that comes with discussing mental health issues that so many of us have faced in our lives. And I've felt personally on the topic of ethics very strongly that I needed to be open and honest about this when walking into this podcast, because people don't feel safe opening up unless they know that other people have walked down the same road. And so be able to truly explore the impact of plant medicine and psychedelics on mental health, I needed to take that step and be the voice for those people. But I won't lie to you all. And I told the audience of this podcast that I will never lie. And that is with regards to why this is of interest to me. Not only mental health challenges that I face and that this could help continue to resolve, but psychedelics and plant medicine, particularly in the microdosing context, have been linked with enhanced creativity and peak performance. And, I know that there are a lot of people in this world who just want to do good enough. Your homeboy here ain't one of them. I want to do as well as I can in every endeavor that I put my little toes into. And so psychedelics as a performance enhancement modality also has tremendous appeal to me. Now, some people might say, okay, PTSD, that is recovering some things that you might have lost so that you can live a fulfilled life, or even live to see the next day if you're having suicidal ideation. The same people might say that peak performance and creative enhancement are frivolities. And okay, find another way to be your best self. Or if you can't be your best self without some sort of mind-altering substance enhancement, well, maybe you need to look into need to look within and find some other solutions. And so with that in mind, do you feel, Sandra, that peak performance and creative uses of psychedelics and plant medicines raise different ethical issues than what we've discussed so far? And if so, how might someone consider them?
Well, I think that's a really good point, Scott. One is just simply the intention is very important to ethicists. What is the reason for versus a reason to do something, right? So we could all consume the same psychedelic, but we could all have 3 different reasons and intentions around it. And that might affect how we consider the quote unquote rightness or wrongness of the action. And in terms of performance, I mean, personally, I think everyone should be able to make their own choices about that. I'm very much focused on individual autonomy, people's ability to make their own choices and being supported in that. But that includes actually being informed, right? So there's a lot of research that still needs to be done in terms of providing accurate scientific evidence that would support that. And so part of that information would be, you should know what it can do in terms of what's been proven and what hasn't been proven. So if you want to be certain that that's going to do a certain thing for you, I would say on the whole that cannot be guaranteed.
When we did our pre-show interview, Sandra, one of the things that you said that really stuck with me was that an ethical dilemma commonly associated with plant medicine use is the risk of moving somehow beyond who and what you are, or becoming someone else. Is that an issue that you see as related to psychedelics as a performance or creative enhancement modality?
Yes.
Well, you can't just leave it at that. What do you mean? Tell me more. I got to hear now. Am I going to turn into a superhero and then be ethically compromised because I'm saving the world?
Sorry, the philosopher in me couldn't resist. But I mean, really, that's a metaphysical question, like a question of our being, a question of like who we are as a person, right? Which is different than asking like, will this, like we all might drink like a cup of tea or coffee to enhance, right, and uplift us, right? Yeah.
Boom. I'm drinking one right now. Coffee for those of you who are just listening.
Cap and everything, yeah. No. and in that sense, there's levels and degrees. Like, is drinking a cup of coffee a day going to change who I am as a person? Well, that does say something about who I am as a person. We can look at like, okay, where did I source the coffee? Or, is it direct trade? And we can ask those sort of questions, as well as like, how does it change me? What are my intentions? What is it? Is it something I'm doing for spiritual practice, for instance? A lot of people use ceremonial cacao now in the mornings as a way to connect spiritually and work with it as a plant medicine versus as a Hershey's bar. Not to degrade Hershey's or the brand in any way, shape, or form, but just to recognize that there's a qualitative difference in how you treat or respect something, whether it is seen as something holy or worthy of treatment of respect versus not. That goes for yourself. So if you're looking towards enhancement, in my mind, if it's towards honor and respect of who you are, but there is this risk in a sense that people feel that, am I going to be someone else? Am I going to leave my family? Am I going to change my job because I go into this experience to transform my life? And for some people, yes. Does that change who you are as a person in a way that's non-supportive, or is it changing in a way that is supportive? Would then be the question.
Interesting. So we recently recorded an episode about psychedelics and professional freedom with someone from Webdelics named Mike Mamola, a lawyer who has left his profession in no small part due to his own psychedelic experiences. And during that episode, the whole issue of, well, what is the impact of making the decision not only to change his professional life, but the decision that came before that, which was to engage in psychedelics. What does that mean for others besides the self that might be impacted by this? In particular, his wife. I think that what I'm hearing is who and what you might become can play out in ways that are beyond just you. I mean, I've got a spouse. I may decide to enhance, become more creative. My spouse might get sick of that. That might not have, my spouse may wake up one day and say, yo, that ain't who I married. Are you saying that would be something that we would want to include in our calculus as we think about this stuff, Sandra?
Well, the funny thing is for me is that, ethically speaking, I feel like you're making those decisions all the time. It's like, for instance, I'm deciding to have kids. We don't know what is going to happen and how we're going to change as a result of becoming a parent, and what journey we'll be going on. And so that decision should be taken with greater respect and honor, and may result in a breakup of the relationship, right? It doesn't always bring people closer together. It may be what, helps us to understand different things that doesn't bring us together, which I really hope that it helps to catalyze the best in us, especially for the benefit of the kids. And the same thing, and I think that just points to, we should respect coming to these medicines with the possibility that, like bringing a child into this world, that child may be yourself, and taking yourself more seriously and your journey in life more seriously, whether you see that spiritually or not. I personally do, and really honoring all of our decisions that we make. And if psychedelics can help people to realize the importance of discernment in all of our decisions, I think that would be a gift.
Yonason, I have just heard it earful. What about you? And what do you have to say about all that? Just be Yonason and tell me.
Well, Sandra, I really appreciated your point about intention, motivation, because that is critical to an ethical outlook. Why we do what we do is integral to what we are doing in and of itself. The question that you raised, Scott, about how following, developing myself may have collateral damage, those people who share my life, that's a question we could really sink our teeth into. That, we believe in my philosophy very much in commitment. And I don't live in a vacuum. And if I want to go live on an island somewhere, go out into the woods, away from people, then I can be fully autonomous. But I have responsibilities. I think one of the real challenges of the modern world is this over focus on rights and diminished focus on responsibility when they go hand in hand. And so I really can't divorce the decisions I make from the impact they have on others. And if I'm in a committed relationship, which I happen to be, and my wife and I just celebrated our 35th anniversary, and it has not always been easy. Accommodating another person in your life, it can be quite challenging. And it works when it works because there's a commitment that was originally made that takes precedent. Now, sometimes lives change, and sometimes there is a legitimate reason why relationships will break up. But that should, I think, be kind of the last resort. What I'd really like to get into, though, in this topic, the idea of enhancing oneself.
Yes.
And in Jewish tradition, Jewish practice, there's a tremendous emphasis on wine. We inaugurate the Sabbath and the festivals with wine. The marriage ceremony is over a cup of wine. Circumcision ceremony is with wine. It's pervasive. And why? Why is there this emphasis? Because wine could be thought of as as symbolizing the physical world, the material world. We are supposed to take from the material world and use that to develop ourselves spiritually, to use the physical and the material in concert with our own spiritual ideals and development. And why does wine represent that so well? Because wine can be extremely enhancing up to a point. And if we pass that boundary, it can be highly destructive. In fact, we are coming up, as we record this, we're coming up on the Festival of Purim, which to look at from the outside is very confusing. It's the one day a year when we have the endorsement to get drunk.
Wow.
And I'm not going to go into all the historical and spiritual reasons for that.
Interesting.
But at the same time, the law says that a person who is concerned that he may become unattractive by drinking has no such endorsement, no such obligation. There's always that balance between indulgence and my personal dignity, my responsibility to the society in which I live. And so if we extrapolate that to these kinds of substances, what Webdelics is focused on, a lot of it has to do with, is this in fact something that is going to enhance my own self and bring out the best? What's the Latin phrase, in vino veritas? When the use of a substance brings out the true essence of a person, then it is beneficial. Assuming to the point where the true essence of a person is something that should be left out, because we all self-censor. I don't say everything that comes into my mind, and I shouldn't. I don't act on every impulse. And I'm speaking just hypothetically now, right? If I find my neighbor's wife attractive, that doesn't give me license to violate my vows or someone else's. So I have to constantly evaluate to what degree is using some sort of artificial means or external means going to help me become a better version of myself? And at what point may it lead me to become a lesser version of myself? And that is a complicated question, especially with substances that are relatively new that are still being understood. There have been authorities, very revered Jewish legal authorities, who came out saying that marijuana is strictly prohibited. Some more contemporary voices suggest that maybe we understand these things differently now, and maybe that hard and fast rule should not apply. But you mentioned earlier my conservative approach, conservative in the sense of being very cautious when we engage these types of things, because we don't always know where they're going to lead.
Well, on that note, and we could have a much richer discussion just on what you uttered a few seconds ago, Yonason. That could be a whole other podcast episode. So thank you for bringing that depth into the conversation. Thank you both, actually, for that, because this is rich stuff. Let's get to some really, really, really rich stuff. If there's anything I didn't appreciate when I began hosting this show that I have come to truly appreciate about plant medicine and psychedelics, is the power that these substances have had when it comes to connecting people to their spirituality and with the, for lack of better language, the larger metaphysical other that some people might call the universe, God, or anything. In fact, we had an entire episode with a psychologist by the name of Owen Fitzpatrick about exactly what the nature of religious belief is and how psychedelic use can enhance it, detract from it, or otherwise interplay with one's faith, and what that means for those who have faith as a central part of their life experience. Sandra, when we had our pre-show interview, you said something else that really resonated with me, and that is that much of the purpose of psychedelics is connecting to your integrity. Actually, maybe I mentioned that a little bit earlier. And I think that it would help to go into a little bit more depth about what you were referring to when it comes to psychedelics as a tool for spiritual reconnection. I'll just say one other thing before we go deeper in this. We're living in a societal turning point right now, because a lot of the traditional religious institutions are in, I'll describe it, transition in terms of their attendance or the number of people that ascribe to them. And so that leaves, at least in theory, a vacuum when it comes to the traditional role that religious institutions have played within human culture, that of a spiritual sanctuary. How can psychedelics fill that void if they can? What does that mean for those who may seek such a void? And what does that mean for those who may be within religious institutions who are considering psychedelics nonetheless as an alternative or a additional tool to connect with the metaphysical greater?
Well, I want to actually start off with what Yonason had actually shared with us, focusing on a bit on relationship and also bringing up actual parts about spiritual traditions. I want to honor and respect Indigenous and First Peoples for having had a long-standing relationship with all these plant medicines. Obviously, not some of the synthetic forms of these, but even some that you may not consider to have traditional origins. Right, like I was mentioning earlier with cacao, we use chocolate not in a spiritual way, but it's available. We tobacco has as in the form of hape or in ceremony is treated differently than how it is consumed now. Alcohol as well. Even some traditions, some like to point out some of the mystery schools around this, and some consider that maybe part of those traditions might have actually had medicinal plants mixed in with the wine. And so it wasn't just the wine in and of itself. It was actually some older practices that were there. But I know we probably can't go into that aspect. but just to honor and respect the idea that, for instance, ayahuasca has longstanding traditions in the Amazon basin, in South America peoples. There's also obviously mushroom traditions throughout the world. That even includes amanita, which also is another legal substance that's available. Earlier was mentioned about concerns around opiates. And kratom is a plant medicine that is also available as an opioid that's been available in Southeast Asia for a long period of time, and even actually helps to cure and treat people who have addiction, in the sense of creating a bridge to healing, or people with chronic pain. And you even mentioned this idea of living and going out in the woods, right? And then you have permission to not be in a relationship. But ironically, I do live in the woods. I live amongst the
Cool.
yeah, on Amamutsan lands, Amamutsan tribal lands, and for me, it's actually created greater relationship spiritually, greater relationship with the trees, the plants, myself, my family, the people who are here. And it was actually being in the cities that made me feel more separate. And coming in relationship, getting back to your question about spiritual connection, is that through these relationships, that for me are both spiritual relationships and, consumptive relationships, it's enriched my life. It's enriched my commitment to my kids. For instance, I'm a divorced single mom of two, and my relationship. I have a relationship with the crows. I have a relationship with, and it's something that everything is meaningful, everything is spiritual, everything is enriched. And in terms of working with psychedelics for that relationship, or plant medicines, because I want to include all of that. There's so much we can learn from traditional medicine keepers, from traditional First Peoples, with respect after we've done our healing and acknowledged more lands, as well as traditions, such as Judaism, right? That is represented here. And I really appreciate so much that I've learned from that tradition, and as well as Jewish mysticism. So I believe that it shouldn't be a competition with your spirituality. It should build on your spirituality. And even if you're part of a more, I don't know, more conservative, like even Christian, Catholic, Baptist, whatever, or Orthodoxy, Jew, when it doesn't matter, Jewish tradition, I feel that it can complement your spiritual practice and your search for meaning and purpose, and not be a competition. And that's my experience, and experience with many others. There can be a break in terms of trying to, like, if you have, but many people feel that they're actually experiencing the divine for the first time, and brings up questions that who don't have a tradition, right? Who have been disconnected because our culture in the West has primarily been disconnected from ourselves, from each other, from nature in particular ways, and from spiritual connection or traditions or practices. And one thing that I think we see in psychedelics isn't just that search for meaning that we all have, but greater connection to spirit. Doesn't mean that it's always positive transformation in that sense.
I hear what you're saying. I can only imagine taking that to one of the ministers that I grew up with in the fundamentalist church. That was the one I attended as a child, and having that preacher thunder to me, well, if you need plant medicine, if you need medicine at all, or any sort of enhancement to connect to your spirituality, maybe you need to dig a little bit more deeply into yourself and reconsider your underlying spirituality altogether, because God is or should or can be accessible to anyone who's willing to approach that being with an open heart, or with humility, or with the need to acknowledge weakness and the forgiveness that we all need under that
actually,
particular tradition.
I would come up to them and I would agree with them. You don't need psychedelics to find spirit. And ironically, for me, at least personally, It was my spiritual path that led me to work more deeply and to show up ethically in this space. This is the last place I thought I was going to end up as an ethicist, but it was through my spiritual path, and it made me even revisit my earlier experiences in my youth with psychedelics and my journey there, and my relationship with people, having grown up in the Silicon Valley with psychedelics being present, but not treated in a spiritual way, right? And now I love that more people are integrating it, not just as, not that recreation and having fun with psychedelics isn't okay too. There's multiple purposes. This gets back to what you're saying before, right? And that intention piece that we were all both of us have been talking about. All three of us actually have been talking about. It's not the thing in of itself or the person in of themselves. It's that relationship and that intention and that experience that will bring it out. Don't don't shoot the messenger here, but that's like, don't blame psychedelics for causing havoc in spirituality. And similarly, don't people have been talking about spiritual bypassing more and more, or virtue signaling, right? Nothing is going to guarantee you spirituality, and nothing is going to guarantee you're going to be severed from spirituality. But let me pass to you and Yonason.
Thank you, Yonason. What would you say to my preacher when he responded to me, even though that conversation never happened?
Well, I might object to his tone more than his substance.
You can hear him, right? We can all imagine him. We've all heard him.
Yeah. But let me do a little experiment briefly. On the count of three, I'd like each of you, Scott and Sandra, to point to your soul. 1, 2, 3. I don't see Sandra participating.
I know. I'm pointing it to you internally.
I can't see. Off camera.
And for those who are listening, I'm pointing to my heart.
Yeah. So most people respond by pointing to their heart or their chest. According to Jewish tradition, the soul resides in the mind, and that is critical to this discussion. If we just sort of step back for a moment, when we talked about treating trauma, I said there's very little ethical problem there. When it comes to enhanced creativity, I'm open to the discussion that it might be permissible, might be beneficial at times for some. When it comes to spiritual connection with God, I need to be convinced, because the relevance of the soul residing in the mind is that what differentiates human beings from animals is our capacity to think conceptually. When the sages identified different stages of life, they called human beings speakers. It's the quality of speech, not because animals they have a rudimentary type of speech. They can communicate information, sometimes even feelings, but abstract ideas, concepts, to produce those in language so they can be communicated to others, that is uniquely human. And that relies upon clarity of thought. So while the sages did say that a little bit of wine can actually settle a person, can help them think more clearly. So that's really when it comes to interpersonal interaction and communication. Whether or not that's going to be able to help me connect with God by in some way impairing, certainly if it's overdone, if it impairs my rational faculties, if I'm no longer thinking with clarity. Now, of course, we could argue, is this making me more clear? And that's a conversation we could have. But the concern is that when we take substance that could interfere with our natural capacity to think on a higher level, it's harder for me to see how that may, in fact, enhance our relationship with God.
Talk to me a little bit more about why not.
Well, let me give you an example from the rabbinic literature. There were 4 sages. They were among the greatest sages of one of the greatest generations. And they went into a deep investigation of spiritual concepts, into the deepest most profound, arcane, mystical areas. And 3 of them were damaged. One of them died on the spot. One went insane and died shortly thereafter. And one became a heretic.
Mm.
Only one of them came out undamaged. And it was because he was able to recognize the point beyond which he could not go. The point at which the secrets, the spiritual secrets and revelations that he was on the brink of uncovering would be detrimental to his spiritual well-being. And these were all 4 extraordinary sages. 3 out of the 4 were unable to set that limit for themselves. And what's really, I think, also interesting in this conversation is that the one who became a heretic, whereas he is quoted and cited for his teachings before this, afterwards his colleagues called him the other one, the changed one. They saw that he became someone other than himself.
Out of integrity.
And seeking truth, seeking enlightenment, seeking understanding. And, that there is always that danger. I don't generally reveal my own experiences from before I was religious, because as a rabbinic figure, I don't want to seem to be endorsing anything that I don't endorse. But I did not grow up religious. I grew up completely secular. And when I was in college, I did many things that college students do. And what I found was, at a certain point, my inclination was, this isn't working for me anymore. Maybe I should try something stronger.
Mm.
And the moment that idea took form in my mind, I just stopped cold turkey, everything. I said, at this point, I cannot trust myself to moderate. I just don't want to go into that area. And the potential benefit has to be proven to me before I can see it as outweighing the far more likely potential cost.
Thank you for your candor. We've covered a lot of ground, and we could cover a lot more. Unfortunately, our time is up, but both Yonason and Sandra, you have truly left those who are watching or listening to this episode with rich food for thought. Thank you for being on the show today. For those of you who are listening or watching, keep tuning in. In upcoming episodes, we're going to discuss the relationship between psychedelics and leadership, psychedelics and aging, and how to prepare for your first psychedelic journey, if you determine that it's an ethical thing to do. I'm deeply excited thinking about it all, and I want everyone who's a part of our journey to feel that way too. Now, if you enjoyed today's episode and want to learn more, be sure to subscribe, leave a review or a comment if you're watching it on YouTube, and tell the folks that you care about what we're doing. Also, don't forget to follow Webdelics on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. And be sure to check out our website, webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com, and sign up to get our blog for trusted and objective educational information about plant medicine and psychedelics. Then tune in next time for another episode of the Webdelics Podcast. Webdelics Podcast.